just starting our journey down the Istio Envoy path. So you made a very interesting statement there about how Istio, I guess, does populates service configuration information down when you have a cluster that's running many services. So you're saying basically it's telling every service proxy about every service in the cluster, not something that's more targeted, like you said, a manifest type of approach. Is that correct?
That's a question for you.
No.
That's the ultimate and pass the buck.
Yeah. Well. I think we're working on several solutions for that. For like one that, as Matt said before, like Josh is working on the minimize memory consumption, and we are also working on the manifest-based config delivery. Those will help you to mitigate those problems.
Do you have a timeline for any of that?
I don't have any. So I think the incremental one, Josh.
As far as incremental goes, I think that there's going to be a few different phases. It is we haven't really had an organized meeting because there's contributors from Red Hat and Google working on this, but we haven't been working closely together yet. We should. As far as just the raw memory reduction, I think that's an ongoing process. Some of it's in already, but most of it is kind of prototyped but not committable, and will just take time. If anybody wants to participate in this effort, collaborators would be really welcome.
And I think something else that's interesting might just be what like mini services means to some people. I mean, we at Lyft, we have a lot of microservices, but then we hear about Google's deployment, and it doesn't even make sense in my brain. So they have like the cardinality at Google is crazy. So that's why they're doing so much of the optimization work. But I mean, I can't speak to Istio specifically, but I expect that even if in its current state, it'd be able to handle like a pretty large number of services. And most organizations, like unless you're talking, I don't know where you work, but unless you're talking about Google or some of the other really, really large web properties with tens of thousands of engineers, like you would probably be okay. Yeah.
Hello. Firstly, thanks to all the guys here for making Envoy great and extensible. Speaking of extensibility, I've seen that there are multiple filters in Istio upstream, as well as Cilium has some Golang extensions. Can you guys comment on it? Is going to pulled in upstream, or how does it really going to work out?
So let me clarify the question. Are you asking about like how do we separate the extension filters between Istio proxy and Envoy upstream?
No, like Istio has developed some Envoy filters, as well as Cilium has developed some Golang extension which has Cassandra Kafka filters. Are you guys planning to bring them upstream, or?
I think that's in Cilium side, right?
Yeah, some are in Istio.
The Cilium stuff is in Go.
In Go, right? The Go extension is in Cilium side. Istio proxy have several filters that is very Istio specific. And there's, I don't think that will be in upstream in short time, or maybe a long time. Yeah, you can.
I mean, from the extension standpoint, I think so far we've taken the viewpoint that if we can find people that are willing to maintain them upstream, and if we deem that the code is generally useful to not just one person, I think we would generally take them upstream. That's why we did all the work last year to do the extension split. It makes it a lot easier for us to track what's core code and what's extension code, and extension code can be compiled out. But as was said, the ball is definitely in the court of the people that wrote the extensions. I mean, they need to tell us about them. It's actually incredible how many people have written extensions. Like, we have no idea what's out there, right?
Correct. So are you planning to have some list or something, like people can discover them? Like some of the upstream maintainers have plugin list which helps users?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting, and it's a great idea. I mean, maybe you could open an issue and we could discuss there. I think right now it's a little problematic on 2 points. Point one is that we don't support loadable modules, so things have to be statically compiled in. That's something that wouldn't be hard to fix, but it's a work item. But more importantly today, we don't actually have a stable API. So we make no guarantee that we won't break the compilation of extensions. Like they're effectively tied to a particular Envoy SHA. That's something that we know that we need to fix, but we have erred on the side of velocity over having a stable API. I think given where we are as a project, this may have to end by the end of 2019, but that's going to be a big community discussion because, once we lock down the API and do API stability, it just ratchets up our maintenance burden by a ton.
Yep. Thanks.
Up here. Up here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So a company is going out and building a new control plane on top of XDS and say the Go control plane library. How many rewrites do you see in the future? Are there a lot? Is there a big kind of gotchas along the way, say over the next 2 years, from your experience?
Sorry, for what particular piece?
For just a general purpose control plane for a service mesh.
Right. So this goes back to the initial question of how opinionated the control plane is, right? I guess the other thing I want to say about that is there's two avenues, right? You build your control plane that conforms to your opinions and your organization's topology, or you go and massage your topology to conform to a managed service or a managed control plane solution. So if you mean do we expect Go control plane to be rewritten multiple times? Probably not, because
I mean more. So you talked about the control plane being 3 pieces.
Yep.
The 2 being implemented already by Go
Yep.
control plane. The 3rd being something custom that every company might want to do themselves.
Yep.
That 3rd part is something I assume you've had a lot of experience with
Yep.
Over the years. And
Okay, I see.
have there been a lot of gotchas along the ways?
Yeah. Okay, I see your question. I'll say what I was going to say, and then you can go on. As at least this is from Lyft's perspective, as Lyft has grown, the needs of the control plane have changed and evolved with it. So features that might have not been needed a year and a half ago, with a couple hundred microservices and a couple hundred engineers, might be different than the needs that we need today in the present. So yes, that's another reason why I think building one control plane to rule them all is very complicated, because as your organization evolves, as your topology evolves, the needs of the control plane might change, specifically in that 3rd part that is very specific and very opinionated to your deployment.
I think also what you can do too, since a lot of people are talking about migrating from where they are right now to Kubernetes, is you might actually have to write it twice. One, to adapt what your current model is to work into Envoy, and then the second one is once you have a better definition of what you want your CRDs or however you want to do your config map within Kubernetes, and a second way of interpreting it that way. So I think based on depending where you are in deployment, if you're adopting Kubernetes or you're just running Envoy, you want to keep your current deployment stack at least maybe once or twice, but they're also not going to be. It's not a lot of it can be complex just because you end up manipulating lots of lines of essentially config files, but it's just a little bit of logic of taking this you might use upstream instead of cluster and mapping that to new word. It's going to be a lot more simple mapping than just complex logic for.
I kind of what I thought of when you asked that question was you were asking how stable is the XDS API. You were not asking that. Okay. Although somebody else may be interested. And
that would force a right if the API was changing and the velocity was high.
Well, the API is evolving because we're adding incremental.
Yeah.
We're not going to break.
We're not going to break CDS.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if there's any question from this side. And then, okay, well, not very question. Okay, I'm going to go here.
So currently we're not running Kubernetes. Can you run Envoy without Kubernetes? Like the pod case, is it just run it as a executable on each instance?
So in plenty of cases, Google will not be running Envoy in Kubernetes. We're running it in our own job management system. I don't think that Lyft is using Kubernetes.
We're in process to it, but we use Envoy as its own standalone process beside an application.
Yeah, so there's definitely, in fact, actually maybe a minority of us who are actually using Kubernetes, which is kind of funny because everybody talks about Istio, but I don't know anything about Istio, so.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I think someone asked me this morning about Envoy's link to Kubernetes. And if I had to wager, I think there's way more people running Envoy outside of Kubernetes than there are people running Envoy in Kubernetes. Envoy is just a binary. Like if you're familiar with Nginx or HAProx, it's the same thing. It's like it's a process that you run with Debian packages or systemd or, yeah.
Right when you go back, there's one. Did you have a question? No? Anyone else have a question? Okay. Yes, here. It's down.
So as a follow-up to that, I think some of the primitives that Kubernetes gives you, like with sidecars, allow you to enforce like the traffic is going to flow through the sidecar. But you can imagine a scenario like that you described where you're running it as a separate process. Can you talk a little bit about how you ensure that communication only flows through Envoy? I imagine that like a compromised host, for example, would be able to kind of circumvent that because there's no other kind of guardrails around it.
I can just start real quick. I mean, there's, and then we can see what other people have to say. There's two options. I mean, option one is you try to make it transparent using something like IP tables. That's what Istio does, and a couple other solutions. The second option, which a lot of other people end up doing, including Lyft, is we have a thin library that people use to make all of their network communication, and that library knows to talk to Envoy. I think there's a bunch of it depends. Like it depends on how transparent you want to make it. It depends on whether you want to mess with IP tables. It depends on how secure it has to be to force traffic through to make it so that no one can circumvent it. So there's no easy answer there. They both have trade-offs, but those are your fundamental options. Did anyone want to add anything to that?
You can also argue too that it's a lot of the carrot method ends up actually working really well in this case, because once developers start playing around with their own, like sending their own requests, they tend to get really frustrated. And so it's actually served us really well at Lyft, where a lot of people come to us like, okay, we're doing this by ourselves, but we're going to include it in the Envoy manifest because we are tired of trying to figure it out. And so it kind of ends up working to our advantage that way.
Hi. One of the things that I've started seeing with service mesh in general is this abstraction of like these things like timeouts, retries, which used to be in the application source code, now has been moved outside and inside the service mesh. So do you guys think, like, is there any workflows where, like, as a developer now, they're like, these things should just work, and people do not think about like what timeout should be, how retry should be done. And like, since the configuration now exists outside the application, I'm curious, is there workflows where developers can still specify these things in the source code itself, and where they still have to think through these things versus keeping it outside, where like there's like the client libraries have their own timeouts versus proxies have their own. I'm just trying to sense if there is like community feels this is a problem.
Yeah, I think Constance mentioned like the thin client that we send around to everyone, which basically allows you to declare that I want to talk to service X and I will get these properties. On top of that, we have the ability for people in flat files to define the defaults, both from the like egress and ingress perspective. And then those values are still overridable by headers. So let's say you needed per request or per endpoint when talking to a service, a different timeout or different policy, you knew the query was expensive or something, you can override that from the headers. So Envoy, tries to be very adaptable in this case and give you, both, you can configure Envoy with a certain setting, but then override it, on a per request basis. And so that's what we do at Lyft, and that's kind of what was mentioned. People have these problems and then they see that Envoy can solve them, and they latch on to that and read the docs, etc.
Yeah, so they're just like when you're setting the request, you add it as another header there. And then like also too, like you can also then enable like entire fleet-wide, like max timeout is 1 second, right? And then after then, you can put like a very strict for certain things there, and like the configs allow you to be that strict and allow other people to be more free-flowing in other cases. There's a question.
Sorry. There's just one more quick thing that I wanted to add. I think sometimes there's a misconception that we want to completely hide things like timeouts and retries and a bunch of other stuff in like within the service proxy. And the way that I would describe it is, more accurately, we want to hide the implementation. We don't necessarily want to hide the intention. And I still do think that we need developers generally to understand networking concepts, like I need a timeout or I need to retry. But in many cases, we can't pick the retry policy on behalf of the user because they have to understand the API that they're calling. So that's how I would phrase it, is that we want to reduce the cognitive load of the implementation, but we don't want to completely hide it from the user what we're doing.
So you guys alluded to Borg, what Google uses internally at scale. For those of us not blessed with Borg, but are hoping to be the next Google and run Kubernetes, what are some of the creative ways you are using Envoy outside of kind of, what normally people are using it for in Kubernetes? And then what kind of problems do you hit when you get to that larger scale? Specifically, with problems with Envoy.
I don't know if you're going to get an honest answer to that.
We only have
Okay, then I won't take too much time with my non-answer. I mean, I think to a large extent, Google has started using Envoy in a variety of ways. Our usage in the Borg context is less mature than the other ones, so we have way more experience deploying Envoy in various forms in virtual machines. So stay tuned. Maybe we can go into more of that kind of stuff next year.
Let's actually
probably one more question.
Yeah, so I think one other thing that I'd add there is that one of the things we learned at EnvoyCon just from seeing all the presentations is that there's plenty of people who are using Envoy as an edge proxy, as a middle proxy. Sidecar is not the only way that people are deploying Envoy by any means. In fact, any way that people are using proxies, people are trying out Envoy in that role. So yeah, don't assume Sidecar in any.
So we saw yesterday at EnvoyCon, someone had a problem with the default circuit breaking. What are some other common pitfalls that people run into when using Envoy, whether it's operating or extending?
So, yeah, I think we've seen a couple questions in the Envoy with issue with the default circuit breaking. Issue they have is usually that is like large latency but not high load requests that will hit the default circuit breaking very easily. The default is like 1K requests at like pending requests at Envoy level. So if you have like request that takes like a few seconds and you have like 1000 QPS, you will easily hit the circuit breaker. There's some especially some machine learning workload are hitting that and raise the issue a couple times. Well,
one thing that I heard is that someone had configured Envoy just using H1, but their actual connections underneath were H2, and they forgot to enable H2, and that solved a lot of their connection issues. So being cognizant of if you're sending H2 requests, use the H2 features or auto.
Yeah, I was gonna say one thing that I would say about defaults is that Unfortunately, this is the case again where it's impossible to please everyone, and if we change the defaults, someone's going to have a very unhappy day, like when that happens. With that said, I think we do recognize that we have a general documentation problem around a couple of these cases, and there are issues opened. So, for example, I would love to have a FAQ on, so you want to perf test Envoy, like this is what you should look at. Or so you want to manage your Envoy memory footprint. Here are all of the things that you can configure around tuning, different types of flow control and stuff like that. Or here's your circuit breaking settings. So we do have a resource tech writer from CNCF who's going to be spending more and more time on the project, and I'm hopeful that he'll tackle some of these things. But I would encourage you to open documentation issues on the kinds of things that you might be confused about. And two, please help if you would like to help. If you have struggled through some of these things and been confused and you feel like you could help others, that would be much appreciated.
I think also one way to ask you your question is also how do you expose it to your developers? And I would say start by exposing a smaller set of features instead of everything. Even for I get overwhelmed by remembering all the features. And so just, choose a few things you want to enable and then slowly add scope to that. Because that could also help for your onboarding as someone who's maintaining it, and then after your application developers as they're learning to use Envoy. That's all. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you everyone for coming. Have a good KubeCon.
Thank you.